Hello and welcome to the Blue Open Studio tutorial video series. The topic of this video will be database connectivity. In this video, we will discuss the different methods of how Blue Open Studio can connect to databases and additional knowledge resources. And we will demonstrate saving trend data to a database, displaying database data in a grid object, and viewing trend data in Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. Configuring databases in Blue Open Studio, you're basically linking tasks from the software, for example, alarms, events, or trends, to tables of the external database via a specific database provider that supports the specific database or database server you've chosen to use. Each history task, which are alarms, events, or trends, can be configured to save the data either to files with proprietary format, which is the default configuration inside of the software, or to an external SQL relational database. And the database information can be displayed both in table format, like the alarm or event control and grid objects, or in a graphical format, like the trend control object. So we can use these features to not only write data or record data to the database, but also to display it as well. And when you're using SQL relational databases, configuring the database connections, it can be a little difficult or a little confusing, not only for the actual database connections and how you have to configure those, but also if you want to use SQL queries, configure things a very specific way. So 3 resources that we've used and we recommend using are listed here: W3 Schools, Connection Strings, and Stack Overflow. W3 Schools provides a great overview of SQL queries and how you can structure them and the functions and abilities that SQL provides. Connection Strings is a nice website that helps you configure the connection string that you need to use in order to connect to specific databases. Our database connectivity isn't just for SQL or Oracle. We could use Access or Excel as well, along with a couple of other options. And the connection string website helps you configure those connection strings for that specific connection to that specific type of file or interface. And then finally, Stack Overflow is just a user-driven site where people can post questions, provide information, answer questions. It's just a nice repository for information. So if you have a question, if you're not sure how to do something, that's one place that you can look. And if you can't seem to find it, you can always post a question, and responses are usually pretty quick. And the membership is very knowledgeable. You just have to know where to post your question. And if you incorrectly post it, they redirect it, and it's pretty easy to follow along. So now we'll look at how we can configure database connections in Blue Open Studio. There are several different locations where this can be done. We've already mentioned how the logging or recording features like events, alarms, and trending can be configured to record data to a database, but there are a few other locations as well. And the first is the project or default database connection. And we will configure that here to use in one of our examples. So in the development, if we go up to the menu ribbon, we go to project and then options, and then we'll see at the bottom of the project settings window, default database. We click on that, and that brings up the default database configuration dialog box. And in here, we have a few settings that we need to configure. The first is which database are we going to configure, primary or secondary? And the primary is the main database or default database that you would configure, where the secondary has an option to either be a redundant or store and forward. So for redundant, this mode, the application allows data in both the primary and secondary databases to be saved. And if one of these databases becomes unavailable, the application keeps saving data in the still connected database. And then when the unavailable database reconnects, then the application will synchronize the data between the two databases automatically. And store and forward allows you to save data in the primary database only. And then if this database becomes unavailable, the application will then save data into the secondary database. And then when the primary becomes available again, the application will move the data from the secondary database into the primary. So these two options, the best way to think about them is redundant is essentially a mirror of the two databases. So the primary is mirrored in the secondary. Store and forward, the primary is used, and if it becomes unavailable, the secondary is a temporary storage location until the primary database comes back up. So when you select anything other than disabled, you will see the fields become available, and these fields would be configured the same for the secondary as they would be for the primary, and that is also regardless of what type is configured here. The only thing this type does is indicate how Blue Open Studio interacts with that secondary database. So for us, we're going to leave the secondary set to disabled, and then we're going to go back to primary, and we see a few fields below that we can configure. The first is the connection string, and this is the defining value or the essentially connection that we'll be using to go to the database. This connection string includes the database server, database name, table name, and any additional properties that may be required. This is where that connectionstrings.com website comes in handy. And then we have two optional fields, username and password. Now you can configure specific users for databases to allow access to certain tables, certain databases, certain properties. So if you configure a user that you want to use, you would enter in the authentication here. For example, SQL, it allows you to use what's called integrated or Windows NT mode, which will use your Windows username and password as your authentication for the database. So this is not necessary to enter in here. And then we have a retry interval, which is default to 120 seconds. That's if the application is unable to connect to the database, it will then retry automatically after this interval has been met. And then under advanced, we see some options for some additional database or table settings. For the majority of projects, the default settings of these values will work. However, if you do need to change things, it's important to know where they're located. We have the time zone settings where we can select either local time plus the time difference. So for example, it's the bias in the local time zone versus coordinated universal time. We can just do strictly local time with no bias, and this one is not recommended for use. And then UTC, which is the coordinated universal time, is the default, and it's strongly recommended to use this. The local time plus time difference is good to use if you are logging time sensitive information and perhaps the time zone or the database is located in a different time zone than the application. And then we have the drop down for milliseconds, whether we want to enable them, disable them, store them in the database table under a separate column, or leave it set to default. And the default uses a predefined format for the current database. Any databases that are previously tested or configured with the most suitable option. Now, when you're using a database that has not been previously configured, the default option attempts to save the milliseconds in a separate field. So for both of these, we're going to leave them at the default settings. And then we have the database gateway information. And this is used if the database is housed in a separate location from the application itself. And we need to connect to it over the internet. And what this allows you to do is you can install the standalone Studio Database Gateway, and that will be loaded onto the system storing the database. And then you would put the IP address of that system here. along with the port. And that would tell the application to go to this system in order to access the database. So the Studio Database Gateway would be stored on that same PC. So Blue Open Studio would be using that as the gateway, as the handshake between it and the database. And then we have three checkboxes. The first is disable primary keys. And for some modules, Blue Open Studio will try to define a primary key to the table in order to speed up the queries. If you're using a database that doesn't support primary keys, for example, Microsoft Excel, then you should select or enable this option to disable those. Then we have disable delimiters. This is more of a troubleshooting option that will disable the delimiters that are used to format communications with the database. These delimiters can cause problems when a trend control or a grid tries to build a query that includes aggregates such as min and max. So if you're trying to formulate a complex query that a grid will send off to the database, and it includes some additional functions or aggregates, those delimiters could be stripped out and you will receive an error. So if you're trying through, say, a grid to compose a complex query to retrieve data, and you have some aggregate like min and max functions in there, they will be stripped out when the query is sent to the database, and then you will receive an error back that either the query is invalid or there are no results. So when you disable the delimiters, it prevents those aggregates from being stripped out, and it sends the query as is, and you will receive the proper return results. And then disable SQL variables is another troubleshooting option. This is used typically for things such as the @ value 1 and a question mark that are often used in SQL statements and queries. Some specific database providers do not support these variables. So if you ever run into an issue where you're getting errors when you try to send a query off or connect to a database and you're configuring a complex query that has those, try disabling those in order to facilitate the connection properly. The biggest one that I run into is disable delimiters, and that's mostly for grids. If I'm trying to configure a SQL query to go through a grid, to connect to a database table to get a specific group of results back, I will typically disable the delimiters, and that will allow that query to operate properly. But for us, we're going to leave everything at default. Before we move on, I should mention that the connection string field can have a tag placed inside of curly brackets, so we can dynamically set this string at runtime if needed. So now I will click on the Browse button next to the connection string, and that will bring up the Data Link Properties dialog. And this may look familiar to some because this is not a Blue Open Studio specific dialog. We are now tied into a Microsoft Data Link Properties window. Excel, Access, even Word will use this to connect to databases. So this format will be very similar to what others have seen through Microsoft and other applications. So for us, what we will be doing is we will be connecting to, in this example, a Microsoft SQL Server database. So I have two options here for SQL. The first is the Microsoft OLEDB provider for SQL and the SQL Server native client. For us, we want the first one, the Microsoft OLEDB provider. I will select it and click Next. And then on the Connection tab here, I will drop down this list to look for a server name. And as you see, mine comes back blank. Some may do that depending on whether or not the software can detect some servers. This may have to do with your user profile or security policies. However, I have one that is loaded onto the system, so I could type this in. So I could type in the computer name / database server. However, if you're going to use an application that you will be moving from, say, a development PC to a runtime PC, you would then have to change that unless the computer names are the same. One way to keep it modular or flexible would be to use a built-in tag or label for the local system. and that is inside of parentheses, we use the word local. And then backslash, and in my case, the server name is SQL Express. And then below that, we have the information to log on to the server. By default, it's set to use a specific username and password, so we could enter those in here. Then we have options to allow a blank password or to allow saving the password. For this example, I'm going to use the integrated security. And then finally, we have the setting for the specific database we want to connect to. So if I drop this down and I see anything populated in here, I have already successfully connected to the database server. So if you've gotten this far and you see things in this drop-down list, you are now able to connect to the database. However, the database we want to use in this example hasn't been created yet. So what I'm going to do first is I am going to bring up SQL Server Management Studio. And then I will log in. And then I will create a new database. As you can see, there's only the system ones here. So I will right click on databases, select new database, and put in the name BOS_train. Now you see the database has been created. I am not going to create any tables. I'm going to leave it as is. And then back in my development, if I drop this down, I now see my new database is available. So I'll select it. Additionally, we have an option here to attach a database file as a database name. So we could put in our configuration settings here for the file. We're going to use one that's already selected. Now if we click test connection, it comes up with a message that says the test connection succeeded. So now we're not only able to connect to the server, we're able to connect to the database itself. And that's as much as you do for the default database. The table and any other properties are configured in the specific feature you are going to use. So I'll click OK, and now we see the connection string here. And this, if I bring up Notepad and I bring it in, we will see here that we see our provider and then the security type, the initial catalog, which is the database to use, and the data source. So this is a typical connection string. So if we wanted to use a tag for the connection string here, it would be something similar to this that we would have to enter in as the tag's value. Typically, this is used if you want to change, say, the initial catalog, or when we get into it, the table. That's mostly what you would change. The provider, integrated security, and the data source usually, in most instances, will not change. So now back in the database configuration, I will click OK. And now we have our default database configured. So now we will create an example of how we can log data to this database. And we will be doing that by creating a trend worksheet that will log to the database. So I'll close out of my project settings, and then in the Project Explorer, I'll go to the Tasks tab, and I will right click on Trend, select Insert, and then I will create a trend worksheet. If you haven't looked at the trending tutorial video, I suggest you do that for more details regarding how the worksheet itself is configured. I will give it a description of database trend, and I will change the history format from proprietary to database, and I will leave save on trigger listed there, and then the second in the field for the trigger we're going to use. And you see, once we change the history format to database, we have an additional column that appears on the worksheet body, and we will configure that in a second. If I click on database configuration, we see similar settings that we did when we configured the default database. The only difference here is now we can add some additional properties, specifically the table. So we have an option here to use the project default, primary, secondary. If I uncheck that, then I can go back through and configure my own database connection that's separate from the project default. For this, I will use the project default, and then down below we have the table selection. And we have two checkboxes. Use the default name, which it automatically configures, and automatically create. So with automatically create selected, what will happen is it'll go out and see if the table name that is entered here exists in the database. If it doesn't, it will automatically create it, create the structure that we need, and then begin logging information to that table. So for us, we're going to uncheck use project default. And when I drop this down, you see that there's nothing listed here. If we did have tables listed in the database, they would show up here. For us, we're going to create a new table called temperature. And we will leave automatically create selected. The runtime fields are used to check on information for the database at runtime. The status field, this tag will receive one of three values to either tell us whether we're connected or disconnected from the database and whether the database is currently being synchronized. And then the reload, when a tag in here changes value, it will reconnect to the database using the updated values in the tags. And this is typically used if you're using curly brackets in any of the configuration fields. So for example, if we put curly brackets in for the table name or the database server name or the connection string as a whole, we would use the reload in order to reconnect to the database server with the new parameters if we've changed them. But for us, we're going to leave everything else other than the table name and use default name as to default. I will click OK. And then now we will configure the rest of the trend worksheet. And I'm just going to enter in a tag here, db temperature. And I will create it as an integer. So now with this field column here, we would put in the name of the field or column in the database table we want to store the values to. If we don't put anything in, it uses the tag name as the column name. So I'm going to leave it blank because I will use the tag name for that. So now I will save, and I'll save this as worksheet 2. I will close it. And the next thing we need to do is create the screen where we're going to be displaying this information. So I will go to the Graphics tab in the Project Explorer and open my template screen. And then I will save this as a new screen called Database. And now what we will do is we will start to place a couple of objects on the screen. The first one that we will place is a trend control object just to view the values of the dB temperature tag. So in the Graphics tab on the ribbon, click on Trend, and then draw one on the screen. And then double click to bring up the properties and go to Data Sources. And now I will click on New to add a new data source, and I will just call it Database. In the source type, I will change to Database, and then I will click on Data Source Settings. And I will leave the top part set as it is. And then once again, I will change the table from the default. And as you can tell, there's nothing listed. So then I will put in the one that will be created, temperature. I will also make sure that automatically create is unchecked because the table will already be there. I don't need to try to create it again. I'll click OK. And once again, as a note, if you haven't looked at the trending tutorial video or the addendum video, please do because it goes into detail of how all of these different fields can be configured. I will need to set an x-axis field. And for this, what will happen is when the database is created, it will not only put in a column for the value of that dB temperature tag, but it'll also put a column in for the time. And that column is called time underscore stamp. And we'll use that as the x-axis field. And then for reload, we'll put in second. And what this will do is, as it reloads, it will go out to the database and access it and retrieve any new information and load it in. And everything else will leave set to default. Click OK, then go into points. And now for my data source, I will change this from tag to database. And for the label, I will put in temperature. And then for the field, I'll put in dB temperature. And I will set the min scale to 0 and the max to 100, and I'll leave everything else set at default. Okay, now we have a way to display the values on a graph. We also need a way to modify the value because we don't have any way for that to change. So what I'm going to do is I am going to go back onto the graphics and open up the link symbols, and I'm going to add a slider. I'm going to drop a slider down here and put in the tag dB temperature. I'll put that there, and I will add a label just so we're all aware of what it does. Okay, so we have all of that configured. And now what I'll do is I'll close the link symbols and my database screen, saving it as I do. And then I'll open my navigation screen, copy my grid button, and modify it to open the database screen, and also the caption as well. Saving that. And then I will run the application. And once it comes up, I will snap my runtime to the right, my development to the left. I'll go to my database screen. I'll start moving it, and as you can see, it's plotting across the trend. And if I bring up Microsoft SQL and I refresh the database and I go under tables, I now see a new table called temperature. And I will open it to view the rows. And we see here that we have 3 columns. We have the timestamp and then the timestamp millisecond. So as we mentioned before, this database will not handle milliseconds in with the timestamp, so it put it out into its own column. And then we have our dB temperature field. As you can see right now, we have 66 rows. If I refresh, we have now 89, 90, 91, and so on. And that's because of how we have our worksheet configured. So now if I go under the Tasks tab and I expand my trend folder and open up the database trend, if I uncheck Save on Trigger and check Save on Tag Change and save, now we will only see values written when the value of the tag changes. So if I come back in here, I have 124 rows. If I come back into development and I change it, I have 130. It didn't catch every single increment, but it did catch a few of them. So as you can see, it's not nearly as many as it was if we were doing it once a second. So now if I were to stop the runtime and back in development, if I bring up my database screen, we will place a grid object and tie that into the database table as well. So I will shrink this over just a little bit to give me some more room. I'll move my slider over as well. And then on the graphics tab, click grid. And just draw that out right here. Go into the properties, and now what we want to do is we want to change the data source from text file to database. When we click on data source settings, we see the same dialog that we saw when we configured the trend worksheet. For this, what we will do is we will still use the project default, and then for the table, uncheck use default name. And this time when I drop it down, I now see a new table that I can select. So I will select my temperature table, click OK. And then when I go into the columns, we see that we have a different layout with the label and then a field column. If you watched the grid tutorial video, we saw in there when we used class tags that we have a field for the members, where each member in the class had its own column. This is the same procedure. We now put in what field each column will correspond to. So in our case, we will want to display two. The first will be the timestamp, and the second will be the temperature. And just like with the class tags, if we don't put anything in the field columns, it will use the label text as the column name. So we could leave it like this, but if we want to be correct or complete, we would put those in for the field names and then put in whatever we want for our labels. And then for the type, we will set the temperature column to be numeric, and we will disable input. And then for the timestamp, I leave that as text because even though it's time-based and we have a type in here for date, date time, and so on, the way that the dates are stored in the table is as a string or as text. So in order for us to display them properly, we have to have this field as a text type. Click OK, and then I'll go into Advanced. And here we want to configure just a few items. So the first is we'll leave user enable set to 1. And then for number of rows, we're going to put in a tag called grid num rows 3. And we will create that as an integer. And the reason we're labeling it as a 3 is because we set up 2 other grids in the grid tutorial video. So we want to use a different set of tags for this. And then for the row number, grid row num 3 as an integer as well. And then finally for the reload, grid refresh 3 and as an integer as well. So with that set, I will click OK, and then I will click out of the object properties. And you see here that the columns are laid out a little uneven. So I will actually go back into my columns here and change the width. And I will set the width for my timestamp to 100. Click OK. And now it looks a little better, but I know that that's not going to be wide enough, so I'll set it to 125. As you see, as we click OK, it modifies it and updates it in real time. Additionally, I know that the temperature isn't going to take up that many, so I will drop this down to 75 and put this up to 150. And now we have a little bit of a better layout. And the last thing we need to do is put a switch down to refresh the grid. So I'll go to my graphics tab and click on the button, place it down at the bottom here, open up the properties, and put a caption of refresh grid. And under command, we'll go to on up, and then in here I'll put a simple assignment, grid refresh 3 equals grid refresh 3 plus 1. So every time we push that button, it'll increment that tag and thereby refreshing or reloading the grid. And then I know we're running out of space, but I'll put one more item right here, which will be a rectangle. And inside of here, we're just going to display the number of rows in the selected row. So I will type in number of rows, and inside of curly brackets, the tag we created, grid num rows 3. And then below that will be selected row, and inside of curly brackets, grid row num 3. Click OK. And then finally I will save. Once I save, I will close my screen and then start up my runtime. Snap my runtime to the right, snap development to the left, and go back to database. And I will start changing the values for the database temperature. And we see right now we have number of rows 130. If I refresh, we see it goes up to 156. Come all the way down and we see the most recent here. And as you can tell, the time here shows that it's 11:32 p.m., where the time, which is the system clock, shows 7:32. That is because of how we have the database set up for the time. We said UTC, which is Universal Coordinated Time. So it does not take into account the time difference or our time zone. So as you can see here, that is a prime example of why you want to be able to configure that and keeping that in mind if you're using time-sensitive data like we are. So if I wanted to change that, I would exit out of the runtime and then back into the development. I'd go to project and then options. Under default database, under advanced, I would select local time plus time difference. Click OK, click OK, click OK. And then I could run this as well. However, before I do that, I'm going to come in to SQL and I'm going to delete this table. Because we have it set to automatically create on the worksheet, as soon as I start the runtime again here, it will recreate that table. If I go back to databases and I start adjusting the value and I refresh, we now see that new records come in and we see the time is about right. There's a slight time difference based on GMT or Universal Coordinated Time and the actual system clock, but you see that at least the hour is right. And then if I come back into SQL and I refresh, I now see our table has been recreated. So one last time, what I will do is I'll stop the runtime. Back in development, I will go into my options and to the default database under advanced, and I will change this from local time plus time difference to local time. Click OK to get out of everything. And I will delete this table just so we can start with clean data. We'll start our runtime again. And this time I'm not going to snap anything. I'll just go into database and modify the values and then refresh. And you see now that the time is coordinated between the two. So that time stamp setting for the databases is extremely important when you're dealing with time-sensitive data. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact ProFace America Technical Support by phone at 1-800-289-9266, option 2, or by email support@profaceamerica.com. You can also visit our website, profaceamerica.com, for drivers, manuals, FAQs, and other product and software information. Thanks again, and have a great day.